Tommy Kissinger here. So great to be with you. And this is going to be the case for the resurrection of Jesus, part 4. We're reading from one of my writings, the Noble Berean series, volume 4, which has not actually been put in print yet, but I have a chapter devoted to the resurrection of Jesus. And we are leaning heavily on the writings of Gary Habermas and Michael Licona's book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. And it is such a joy and privilege to bring this information to you. The resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ. Yes, it is a matter of personal belief. It is a matter of faith. It is a matter of the Bible, the Holy Scriptures. But it is also a matter of history. So when you look back through history, what are you looking for? You are looking for degrees of probability of whether something actually happened or not. When you study the information, it is actually quite overwhelming, and it is in favor of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ, that it was an actual historical event that actually took place. So we want to pick up where we left off, and we've been talking about the testimony of women as far as the resurrection of the Lord Jesus Christ is concerned. As far as the gospel writers inventing testimonies that women were the first witnesses of the empty tomb, it seems highly unlikely. Habermas and Licona drive this point home in their conclusion of the matter when stating, if the gospel writers had originated the story of the empty tomb, it seems far more likely that they would have depicted men discovering its vacancy and being the first to see the risen Jesus. Why would they not list the male disciples, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, and avoid the female issue altogether? If the account of the empty tomb had been invented, it would most likely not have listed the women as the primary witnesses, since in that day a woman's testimony was not nearly as credible as a man's. Thus, the empty tomb appears to be historically credible in light of the principle of embarrassment. JET, J-E-T. The acronym used by Habermas and Licona in reference to all of this is JET, J-E-T. They find the acronym JET helpful in remembering our arguments for the empty tomb. The Jerusalem factor, enemy attested, and testimony of women. So the empty tomb is represented by the Jerusalem factor, enemy attested, and the testimony of women. Conclusion. Gary Habermas has surveyed almost 30 years of German, French, and English critical scholarship relating to Jesus' resurrection. As a result of his research, he states, perhaps no fact is more widely recognized than that early Christian believers had real experiences that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. In particular, virtually all scholars recognize Paul's testimony that he had an experience that he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. Equally well recognized is that James, the brother of Jesus, was an unbeliever before he thought that he too met the risen Jesus. Seldom is the historical authenticity of any of these testimonies or the genuine belief behind them challenged by respected critical scholars, no matter how skeptical. Lastly, although the empty tomb lacks the nearly universal acceptance by critical scholars that these other events enjoy, the majority of scholars still clearly seem to think that it is probably also a historical fact. Habermas and Licona have presented evidence for Jesus' resurrection using a minimal facts approach, which considers only those data that are so strongly attested historically that even the majority of non-believing scholars accept them as facts. Shortly after Jesus' death, his disciples believed that they saw him risen from the dead. They claimed that he had appeared to individuals among them as well as to several groups. Two of those who once viewed Jesus as a false prophet later believed that he appeared to them risen. Paul, the church persecutor, and James, the skeptic and Jesus' brother. Both of them became Christians as a result. Therefore, not only do we have the testimony of friends, we also have heard from one enemy of Christianity and one skeptic. Finally, we have the empty tomb. These facts point very strongly to Jesus' resurrection from the dead, which accounts for all 5 facts very nicely. The bullet points below, summarized by Habermas and Lacona, bring the whole argument together and leave the enemy, skeptic, and the believer with a nice, concise snapshot of the historical evidence in favor of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The 5 facts, or the 4+1. Jesus' death by crucifixion. The disciples' beliefs that Jesus appeared to them. Conversion of the church persecutor Paul. Conversion of the skeptic James, and the empty tomb. In light of all that has been presented, Habermas and Lacona summarize their thoughts and acknowledge the existence of opposing theories by stating, however, as any good historian and scientist knows, a good theory must be able to answer objections and competing theories. Any opposing theory to Jesus' resurrection, however, is going to have to account for all of these facts as well as others. These 5 facts that we have covered accomplish 2 things. They provide compelling evidence for Jesus' resurrection, and they stand as data that must be accounted for by any opposing theory. Finally, Habermas and Lacona have this to say about opposing theories. We will see that opposing theories to date simply cannot account for our collection of facts, thereby leaving Jesus' resurrection as the best explanation of the known facts. Unless the skeptic can produce stronger data in support of another cause, the most rational explanation is that God raised Jesus from the dead. Habermas and Lacona have not based their argument that the disciples saw the risen Jesus on a specific authorship of the Gospels. Rather, they have presented 9 sources in 3 categories that provide early, multiple, and even non-biblical testimony that they were making this claim. Keep in mind that the disciples of Jesus were willing to suffer and die for their beliefs that they had witnessed the risen Jesus. Listen to that again. Keep in mind that the disciples of Jesus were willing to suffer and die for their beliefs that they had witnessed the risen Jesus. In reference to this, Habermas and Lacona state, remember that people may die for what they believe is true. But it is not reasonable to think that an entire group of men would be willing to suffer horribly and die for something they all knew was false. Let that sink in. How fitting it would be to end this teaching on resurrection by hearing from the one we are speaking of. These are the words of Jesus as recorded by John on the Isle of Patmos in Revelation 1:18. It says, and he says, I am the living one. I died. But look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and the grave.